I'm here with Libertarian Realist, who responded to a comment on my video, or asking, am I still a libertarian? My video on, am I still a libertarian? And I just reached out to him and asked him if he wanted to chat on my channel. I've come across his videos on YouTube a couple of times, and he's definitely well read on some of the science of race realism. And he also shares in the frustrations with libertarians and the right. I just want to read something that you had written on your blog a while back. This was in November 2015, I think. You said, Donald Trump has finally crossed the line with his call to halt Muslim immigration. That's not who the GOP is as a party, and that's not conservatism. If you want to know what's truly conservative, all you need to do is ask people like Jeb Bush, Bill Kristol, Paul Ryan, and Lindsey Graham. They're conservatively denounced the Donald as an unhinged, racist bigot who is soiling the robe of conservatism and should go to hell. Of course, it was conservatives like Bush, Kristol, Ryan, and Graham who drove the country into the most expensive and longest wars in the nation's history in Iraq and Afghanistan. It was demagogues like Trump who opposed our massive sacrifice of treasure and blood in the conservative Iraq war. Trump warned that toppling Saddam Hussein and other secular leaders in the Middle East would destabilize the region and create power vacuums for radical Islamists to fill. What a reckless lack of judgment on Trump's part. Trump has also failed to embrace the conservative party policy of arming Islamic rebels in Syria in the hope of overthrowing the secular Assad government. What could possibly go wrong? I mean, the hundreds of thousands of displaced Syrian refugees and the millions of people posing as them are natural conservatives. Just invite them all in. Invade the Muslim world and invite the Muslim world. That's the conservative thing to do, invade and invite. So yeah, I just would like to get your thoughts on this, I would call it treachery, that we see in the neocons and to some degree in the libertarians as well.
Yes, well, that was my sarcastic indictment of the conservative movement. It has failed to serve as essential to America, namely our freedoms and our identity as a people. And a similar critique could be lobbed at the libertarian movement. It has failed to advocate for our liberties, and it has instead embraced this sort of globalist vision of liberty only in the abstract. And libertarians and neocons are basically both globalists. The libertarians, at least, who advocate for open borders. Libertarian nation must be mindful of the threats that come from outside that nation, from populations who are hostile to liberty. And if you're going to insist on some kind of egalitarian open borders regime, then you are not doing your foremost job of defending your citizens from external threats to their liberties.
Right. So, do you think that these neocons, do you think that they will eventually sort of bend the knee, or are they just going to be fighting Trump for the next foreseeable future? And if so, what can we do to change that?
I think the neocons have been sidelined to some extent, but they're not going away. They're going to grab onto somebody else next time, whether it's Marco Rubio or somebody else of his ilk who's easily manipulated into the neocon position. I don't think that Trump, since he won the election, has been quite as strong in opposing the neocon agenda as Trump was before he won the election. He's invited in a lot of hawks into his administration. He's calling for a $54 billion increase in military spending, which, if you're not of a mind that we need to start World War III with Russia, seems rather unnecessary. We need to put some pressure back on Trump. And part of the problem with Trump is that he came in there basically just riding on his own Trumpian platform, and he had no infrastructure in the think tanks, very few qualified people in the military who were avowed Trumpians. So to some extent, he had to go dip into the establishment in order to form a government. But he needs to be reminded who put him into power. It wasn't the establishment.
Right, for sure. And I think that Trump realizes his voter base does not align with these people. But the fact of the matter is, he's not a dictator, and he does have to work with people or find another option. I think he's a very creative fellow, and he's got, Bannon as a strategist. So I think that on things like the healthcare debacle, I think that he's sort of playing well with that, and he might be able to take out some of these major figures like Paul Ryan in 2018. As far as foreign policy, I have to agree. I mean, I never liked the big bravado, sort of American exceptionalism, and Trump's not really an exceptionalist, but he would say our military is depleted, and we need a strong military in order to be number one.
Right.
Which I don't know if that's completely true. Our spending has just been increasing on the military the whole time. So to say the answer is more spending, from a libertarian perspective, it's a tough sell. But I realize most people aren't libertarian.
Well, we are in no immediate danger of being surpassed militarily by any other country, even if we left military spending exactly the same as it was during the Obama years. I mean, you could say it's been depleted relative to where it was at its highest of weaponry or aircrafts or spending in relation to GDP. But, I mean, as with any government program, at the bare minimum, you should be asking, why is this spending necessary? And wanting to be number one or wanting to get back to where we were at some previous point by some arbitrary measure, it does not constitute a need. I don't think that the military conflicts, the Neocons was trying to defeat militarily an ideological movement known as radical Islam that spreads through non-military means. I mean, it literally cannot be defeated militarily when radical Islam is being spread through migration throughout Europe. I mean, it would make just as much sense to wage a multi-billion-dollar bombing campaign on Afghanistan after a terrorist attack as it would on London after somebody who happens to be British in name only but Muslim by identity commits some atrocity. So this invade the world, invite the world mentality is extremely expensive to enforce and extremely ineffective and, in fact, counterproductive.
Yeah. Can you go into a little more why we can't just, knock the hell out of ISIS? From what I understand, it's because they're a decentralized, network there. There's not like just one person at the top of the ISIL or ISIS.
Yeah, I'm not a military strategist, but Donald Trump, I believe he said he wanted to knock the shit out of ISIS, but I guess he would also knock the hell out of them after he did that. Um, but I mean, there are certainly militia groups operating in Iraq and Syria that could be subject to a tactical drone attack or something. I'm not inherently opposed to that, but I think a better overall strategy would be basically to, if not support the dictators who kept ISIS in check, and Saddam Hussein kept al-Qaeda in check while he was in power. He was more effective than anything the U.S. military did to prevent al-Qaeda from operating in Iraq. And so this insane policy that Bush, Obama, Clinton implemented to try to topple Gaddafi in Libya and Assad in Syria, we're basically toppling people who are more allies than enemies. Maybe they're bad people, maybe they treat their people horribly, but they could have been, and in practice were, allies in the fight against organized terrorist groups and in the fight against the refugee crisis. I mean, it was Gaddafi who warned Europe that if he were overthrown from power, basically Europe would start turning black, because all the migrants from sub-Saharan Africa would no longer be contained in Libya. They would just go on through to Spain, to Italy, to Greece, and upward into Germany and Sweden, where they can get the best welfare benefits. And the population projections for Africa are absolutely staggering. The population will triple before the end of the century. And they're going to be mostly people who are just barely subsisting in desperate poverty, subject to all kinds of political persecutions and wanting to flee into Europe for various and obvious reasons. And if Europe does not summon the fortitude to start saying no categorically, then it will just be a constant flood of boat people onto Europe's shores that will forever change the character of Europe and ultimately Europe into more of a third world hellhole.
I couldn't agree more. I think a lot of people, when they hear stuff like this, they get sort of defeatist. They say, "Well, what can we really do?" And this is being pushed, of course, by the politicians who say, "Oh, this is something we just have to accept, and we have to get used to these terrorist attacks." Obviously, we're recording this about a week after the most recent truck slaughter. Well, not a slaughter, but attack in London. And this is going to continue. But what do you think it'll take for people to wake up to this? Are you seeing any sort of normies out there or blue-pilled folk who are reacting to this, or are they just sort of shuffling their feet and ignoring it?
Well, I'd like to think that facts would wake people up. I would like to think that reality itself would wake people up, and for some people it will. But what we're really up against is an egalitarian moral dogma that has hijacked and crippled our natural defenses. When Swedes see refugees pouring into their cities and committing rapes and attacking ambulances and setting cars ablaze, they internalize this and say, well, there must be something wrong with us that we haven't integrated these people. So no matter how much stark reality these Swedes are exposed to, those who still continue to internalize through some guilt complex that they are responsible for other people's then nothing will change in terms of Swedes waking up. So I'm not I've been to Sweden. I've been to Malmo, which is one of the hardest hit areas in terms of refugee resettlement. I've been to Stockholm, and there's still a lot there that is not gone to hell and that is worth preserving. But I see these Swedes just kind of walking around, going about their business. Meanwhile, it's almost if they can't see or they don't want to see the ultimate consequences of what they're doing. Like they just need to be woken up somehow. But I don't know exactly if there's one thing that can be done to get through to them. I just continue to wake people up who are able to be woken.
Yeah. Well, I think that libertarians, I think it's a little bit easier to get through to libertarians sometimes, but I've also criticized libertarians heavily because they just aren't, at least half of them just aren't willing to deal with race realism. What do you Are you able to tell the difference between the ones who will be receptive to it, or just to kind of save time, or is your strategy just put the facts out there and see who gravitates towards it?
Well, I think for the sake of my own motivations and my own mental health, I think it's better to operate under the assumption that people are persuadable, but not to invest too heavily in ultimately being successful in persuading them, because you never know exactly who is and is going to maybe at first put up an opposition to what you're saying, but then maybe later on think it over. I've seen so many people on YouTube over the past few years who started off as basic libertarians, and maybe you would consider yourself among them, who have become over time much more nationalistic and much more realistic about cultural and racial incompatibilities with their libertarian ideals. Now, every political ideology has some core foundational assumptions about human nature. The Marxists obviously believed that human nature was malleable, that if you just overthrew the structures of capitalism and replaced them with structures of communism, then people would adapt and greed would no longer be a problem. Obviously, that was a fatal mistake, a misjudgment of human nature. But if you look at the premises on human nature held by most libertarians, even most people who call themselves conservatives, they share a very similar flaw with Marxism. They believe in this idea of free will to such an extent that they believe that people can just come in from anywhere, regardless of background, certainly regardless, for most of them, regardless of racial background. Some of them will say, well, you have to at least be culturally compatible. You have to be Judeo-Christian or something the conservatives will say. It's really not true, because there are populations in Northeast Asia who do not have much of any Judeo-Christian background or tradition who are compatible by most measures of conservative and libertarian standards for being economically self-sufficient and having low rates of crime. But this emphasis on free will basically causes to be deniers of the influence of genes. Now, all human traits are the product of some mixture of genes and environment. We aren't just our genes, but nor are we just our environment or just our culture or language or any other kind of cultural construct. Ultimately, the genetic makeup of a nation does matter, and some populations are going to be more compatible with society than others. It's libertarians to accept, but it is a reality, and ignoring that reality will not help you advance your cause.
Right. I I also will argue that even if it were entirely environmental, if culture was environmental, we still don't have a rigorous idea of how to transform culture. I mean, you see that take Muslim extremism, for example. The second generations appear to become more radicalized, and even the people that you would say are moderate Muslims, they can be, turned, especially if they go into prison. They're frequently turned because essentially they're not being good Muslims um, if they choose to just get along with the host society. And as the demographics change, then they're going to get braver and braver.
Yeah, there is this phenomenon where second generation Muslims and other types of immigrants too, I think that they tend to feel more alienated from society, and therefore prone rebellion or becoming extremists or devolving into gang activity and pursuing a life of crime. We see that with Hispanics often, where the people who come here initially are just kind of fitting that stereotype. Oh, they're just looking for work, and they're hardworking and all that, and then their kids end up being misfits.
Yeah. So let's get in some of the race and IQ stuff. Would you say that the IQ is the biggest factor for race differences? I mean, obviously, we know it's not just skin color, but how much do we know about genes? And yeah, do you think that IQ is the biggest factor in behavior?
Well, we do know that IQ is associated with a whole lot of other things besides the ability to take IQ tests. It's associated with life outcomes as far-reaching as income levels, to ability to maintain a stable marriage, to likelihood to committing crime or becoming a drug addict. So maybe it's not the IQ itself that is driving these things, but it just so happens that IQ is associated with lots of other traits that also happen to be highly heritable. Now, when I say highly heritable, when it comes to IQ, almost all studies show that the variations in IQ in the United States are more than 50% genetic, with most credible twin studies showing around 75 up to 80% genetic. So it is more genetic than it is environmental. And as for the racial differences, the white average comes in at around 100. The Hispanic average comes in around 90, and the black average comes in at 85. And in sub-Saharan Africa, most countries there have IQs around 70, some below 70, which is like retarded by Western standards. Now, that doesn't mean that they are stuck at 70, that if you took the population of sub-Saharan Africa and give it a Western standard of upbringing, yes, their IQs will rise. But immigrant studies show that IQs only rise to somewhere in the middle. So if, for example, somebody from a 70 or a representative sample of people from a 70 IQ country migrated into a 100 IQ country, their kids who grew up with that 100 IQ country will have an IQ somewhere in between 70 and 100, probably in the low 80s.
Okay, I have a couple questions. First of all, do you know exactly why? I mean, I've heard that it's the 25-point IQ difference from African American blacks and sub-Saharan African blacks is due to the admixture of white um, breeding, intermixture. But do you think that that alone is enough to explain the difference?
That explains some of the difference. Black Americans, on average, I think, have about 20% white admixture. So that's significant enough to raise their IQs a little bit. But if you want to know like what proportion the difference between blacks with an 85 IQ versus blacks in sub-Saharan Africa with a 70 IQ is down to environment, I would say it's probably slightly more environmental in that comparison, as you're comparing radically different environments. Whereas in the United States, when you're comparing races that share basically a similar environment and a similar overall political system and culture and media and schools and everything else, then the environmental difference is much smaller.
Yeah, and just a correction, I think I said 25. It's a 15-point difference. Let's see. Can you explain why twin studies are important when looking at race and behavior?
Well, twin studies are one of the best ways we have of trying to estimate heritability. There's no perfect way to do it, which is why heritability estimates, can vary from 50% in one study for the same trait to all the way up to 80% for the same trait, because you can't ever perfectly control for environment or you could theoretically construct an experiment like that where you took a large enough people and put them all into the exact same environment, but that would be unfeasible and unethical. So the best we can do is an estimate, and by comparing twins who are identical, who share the same genes, what you find is that even when twins are like separated at birth and never had any contact with each other, they're raised in two separate households, often grow up to have remarkably similar traits, not just similar IQ scores, but similar musical tastes, similar careers, similar personalities, even though they never met and grew up in entirely separate environments. So that's the power of genes ultimately, that shows that nature explains someone's ultimate identity more than nurture does. Mm-hmm. Provided that people are given a basic, minimal standard of upbringing from which to develop. If you completely deprive a person of the necessary access to information or even nutrition to develop properly, then obviously they'll be stunted.
Yeah, I've heard some sources say breastfeeding is helpful in that regards, and probably other just basic level nutrition. What was your emotional reaction to some of this stuff? Were you really shocked when you first started getting into it, and were you resistant to a lot of the facts and stuff about race realism?
I wouldn't say that I had a real strong emotional reaction to it. I tried to come to it with an open mind. It's just that I was never exposed to it throughout all my years of schooling. So when I came upon it, and I came upon sites like American Renaissance and found the research of Philippe Rushton, who wrote the book Race, Evolution, and Behavior, that's when I discovered race realism. And before that, I did consider myself to be politically incorrect on race, but I just never, I guess I took a view on race that it was bad culture that was causing the racial problems, and that if blacks would just stop being so ethnocentric and be more individualistic like whites, then we could all get along. But in some ways, I still hold to the hope that if living in a multiracial society is inevitable, that we could stop magnifying these hostilities so much. I'm somebody who agitates a race war, but when whites are the ones who are being preyed upon politically and sometimes literally on the streets, and 85% of violent crimes that involve blacks and whites are the victims. So whites are the victims when it comes to the use of their tax dollars. Blacks are net tax recipients, and whites are net taxpayers. You get all into affirmative action, these other things, and yet whites are supposedly privileged. You know, we have the privilege of being castigated for being privileged.
Yeah, I actually watched your video about white privilege, and I guess that would be a good softball question. What's wrong with the idea of white privilege? Isn't it true that white people have all the power in this country, and therefore they should make accommodations to people who haven't had the same opportunities that they've had? And yeah.
Well, I mean, you can define white privilege such that if you happen to be in the majority that you're privileged. So, okay, then there's lots of Japanese privilege in Japan and lots of Congolese privilege in the Congo, just by virtue of being in the majority and everybody assuming that you're part of the in-group. But if you're going to say that white privilege actually exists in anything meaningful physiologically, then you run into a very serious problem in the fact that Asians who presumably don't have white privilege actually earn more than whites on average, have longer life expectancies on whites than average, are incarcerated less on average than whites. And so in any kind of racial disparity that the white privilege mongers point to involving blacks and whites, well, the disparity is usually bigger between Asians and blacks. So either Asians do in fact have white privilege, or Asian privilege is simply more powerful than white privilege.
No, you're not allowed to talk about Asians because that just throws a wrench into. No, it's true. I mean, Asians, like you go to Japan, it's very homogenous and they're very civilized, and they're just completely a different standard deviation in the same way that between whites and blacks. So yeah, the race mongers have a hard time dealing with that. I don't know. You haven't heard any good counters to that argument, have you?
Not actual arguments, they're just more protestations. Like people will comment on the video when I've made that argument about Asians and the supposed necessary explanation for Asian privilege. They'll say, well, Asians have also been oppressed. They've also been discriminated against. Like, well, so what? That actually bolsters the argument that discrimination and oppression doesn't cause people to be poor, and not in 2017 anyway. And you know, to some extent, the success of Asian Americans may be attributed to the fact that immigrants who came from places like China and South Korea and Japan generally weren't the poor people who couldn't afford and had no means of getting here. They tended to be people who sought careers or like in engineering or software development, or wanted to get into our universities. So in some ways, Northeast Asian immigration has been eugenic, at least from the standpoint of IQ. Now, some white nationalists would say that that's not good just to have a bunch of Asians take your country, and I understand that objection, but it's certainly preferable to having a bunch of low IQ refugees from the Congo or Somalia.
Yeah. Well, I hadn't really thought of that, but I think it's true. Like the Asian countries, they don't. Well, they're not coming from a country where, uh, if you're poor, you might die, and so they don't have that just like need to escape. Um, at least now, there was communist China, but I don't think they were coming to the U.S.
Well, I mean, just by sure numerically, there's a lot of poor people in China and India, and India, as its country IQ is pretty low. I think it's around 90, certainly much lower than China and Northeast Asia. And yet the Indian Americans tend to be the elites from India, so they do very well economically and academically in the United States.
Oh yeah, it's ridiculous. And now the colleges, they're having to. Well, it's the Asians who are complaining about affirmative action because they're getting pushed out because you can't have that many Asians in there.
Well, that's interesting. They can't get their story straight, actually, because most of the Asian activist groups, these are social justice groups that claim to advocate on behalf of Asian Americans. They want to be treated like a victim group. They come up with all these reasons why they're underrepresented in movies, and they come up with all these grievances to foist upon whites because, they've learned that when you push the white guilt button, cash comes out, benefits come out, recognition comes out, awards and praise and blah, blah, blah. If you the Asians who are more likely to live in urban areas than whites are going to be probably more likely to be exposed to the problems of inner city black crime. But the Asian activist groups don't complain about that. I think the Asian shop owners and the restaurant owners, the working class Asians who are actually having to live in these inner cities and deal with the problems of living around blacks, they know that Asians are much more likely to be targeted for robbery, rape, and murder by a black person than by a white person. But it's not a social justice crusade. It's just generic crime.
Definitely. I mean, I think that it's kind of a shame though because all of their, they do have a higher IQ and that's not really going to change in the next decade, but I think that they could lose their drive and their success if they start falling into this victimhood trap. It's that is something that's. I mean, it's universal. I think maybe some people are more susceptible to it than others, but it is somewhat universal in that if you say take welfare or whatever, it's like a drug, it's an addiction, and I think no matter what your race is, I think it is hard to get out of that. So it'll be interesting to see. I hope they don't go down that road.
Well, I think since the 90s, the Asian vote has increasingly gone Democrat. Obviously, the Asian vote isn't all that important nationally because it's so small, but it's important in places like California and other places that have high Asian populations. And I mean, it seems like they're less voting their economic interests than their group identity and wanting to be part of the minority opposition bloc that's the Democrat Party. So, I mean, if that's something that's going to be more permanent, then we ought to be concerned from a libertarian standpoint when places become more and more Asian and less white.
Yeah, what do you think is the reason that Asians, well, their culture developed in such a way that they didn't have the emphasis on freedom as much? I guess it's not a linear thing. And when you're thinking about libertarianism, it's like, yeah, whites we aren't the smartest ones, but somehow we ended up as the group that were like most likely to be liberty minded and want freedom and stuff. Do you think that that maybe has roots in sort of, well, the culture, the upbringing, or maybe there's some kind of genes that predispose you for um, certain social hierarchies?
Yeah. Well, it's been long observed that while Asians are smart in the sense of being able to carry out tasks, um, in terms of creativity, uh, they haven't shown it to as great an extent of whites have in literature and the arts, um, and even scientific inventions. Whites have led the way. And when I say whites have led the way, obviously it's not the average white with 100 IQ. We're talking about the far right tail of the bell curve. And so it could be the case that the wide IQ bell curve is more wide. In other words, it has a bigger standard deviation. That claim has been disputed by some that say no, Asians and whites have the same IQ. Maybe white different than Asians in creative tasks because of differences in testosterone levels, or maybe it's just down mostly to culture. But it is well observed and known that men and women, while they have about the same average IQ, women are much more concentrated toward the middle, meaning that on the far right tail of the bell curve, there'll be a much greater representation of males relative to females. And of course, when we talk about IQ differences between white and Asians, the difference in IQ is mainly down to the mathematical and spatial rotation type subtests. On verbal IQ, Europeans and Asians tend to do about the same. So, in short, it's complicated.
Yeah. The more you learn about genetics, the more you realize how little we know. Which is why we can't just chalk it up to, oh, diversity feels good. So,
Well, the one thing that, is not a viable explanation for anything or a viable assumption for anything is that of innate equality. Because while it may not be as simple as an average IQ difference, there are differences.
yeah, no, I'm not saying that it's all relative, but yeah, there is a certain amount of humility, and part of the problem is just we don't have, the ability a lot of times to research this stuff. I mean, there are people like brave crusaders in the genetics field. You mentioned Rushton and let me think, Linda Gottfredson and stuff. So there's definitely people out there, but it's tragic if you just think about how much more we could know if we were allowed to do that stuff. If there wasn't
Yep.
this politically correct mandate.
Well, yeah, but scientists who actually study it I mean, they kind of keep to themselves because they know how their conclusions will be met in a wider public, but amongst themselves, they know. I mean, geneticists who research and um, psychologists who research IQ differences, the so-called egalitarians like James Flynn,
Mm.
he basically agrees with Charles Murray that there is this racial gap. They agree exactly on what the racial gap is. It's like one standard deviation. And, only a dogmatist, an outright dogmatist who is not being scientific at all would say, well, there's this gap, therefore it must be 100% one thing, environment or culture or genes. I mean, it's obviously not totally genes.
Well, or they will just circumvent that, having to dispute that by saying, oh, IQ isn't real. It doesn't measure anything. It's just a made-up test.
Yeah. But then when there's a case of mercury poisoning that causes IQ levels to drop, then they become very concerned.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about kind of what you see as, I dare say, solutions. Politically, it must be sort of a balance when, as a libertarian, how much do you think that the government should, say, promote like eugenics? Because we've definitely been promoting dysgenics through the government. So you could
Right.
argue that just it's sort of a, compensation to make up the ground that we've lost, to advocate for some of that stuff. Where do you fall in sort of government, either encouragement or outright programs or bans on certain things that either promote eugenics or discourage dysgenics, sorry.
Yeah. Well, obviously, you wouldn't want to give government unlimited authority to go out and promote eugenics. But I mean, that's easy for people to see, and people get scared by the very word eugenics. They think that automatically must mean like forced sterilizations or concentration camps or some other horror. But it's also dangerous for the government to promote dysgenics. Usually it's not a deliberate attempt to promote dysgenics, but it's just a side effect of their egalitarian commitments. And the welfare programs that have been in place since the 1990s have be dysgenic in the sense that they enable and incentivize low IQ populations, particularly African inner city populations, to have kids that will be taken care of basically by the government. These people they don't have to worry about having fathers anymore. And there is something to the conservative argument that black families were much stronger before the welfare state than they have been. There are lots of other ways in which the government ends up promoting dysgenic policies through immigration, favoring refugees, and even in the entitlement programs, taking resources away from young tax-paying people in their childbearing years to old and infertile people who will not be reproducing ever again. All those things, the fact of either encouraging people who are of low IQ or high crime proclivity to have more births, or discouraging people who are young and healthy and intelligent from ever having kids. And it's a tragedy when you see beautiful, intelligent young women going to college, going deep into debt to pursue some meaningless career that will ultimately leave them miserable by the time they're in their middle ages. And they look around, they're empty, and they've been a total dead end in service of some sort of aspirational career or women's empowerment goal. I mean, feminism has been highly destructive in that regard, and dysgenic as well.
Right. I mean, it seems like the left will do whatever they can. Well, it seems like all of the aims of the left are towards what is just unnatural and, the worst and most destructive for survival, really, survival of individual, of society. And I want to ask you why that is. I don't know if that's a fair question because that's probably hard to answer.
Why leftists pursue destructive policies?
Well, yeah. I mean, do you think it's like a instinct sort of that they're I guess I actually just bought the book, just got Anonymous Conservatives, RK theory.
Ah,
So he goes into the differences between the breeding strategies for reproducing. Um, and so I guess if you look at it from that stance, then what the liberals are doing, it's not destructive in their sense, but from our sense, if you're a K-selected animal, which human beings are technically K-selected, um, then then it's
yeah.
not
Well, we
really
are. I mean, these political ideology battles are at root gene battles. I mean, they're battles between multiple different genotypes. I mean, RK is one way to look at it. I look at it as more broadly inherited personality traits just acting themselves out. I mean, nobody or very few people are self-consciously advocating for political goals because they think that they are advancing their genetic interests. They're just doing so because they are women tend to be hardwired toward valuing things like compassion and fairness and social justice, and they can be easily exploited by politicians who frame their policy proposals in nurturing type language, and that leads to pathological altruism, which is being on display most dramatically in places like Sweden, which is the most feminist, avowedly feminist government in the world, and Canada, which has elected this caricature of a postmodern male feminist, Justin Trudeau. I mean, it's like, but that's, Justin Trudeau is a prime example of the type of genotype you get when you allow leftist sentiments to be injected into politics.
That's a good point. Yeah, the male-female divide is very, very strong, and we are severely lacking in our testosterone in the West.
Yeah, I mean, well, of course, there's a theory that our environment and our diet is causing us to actually lose our testosterone, which has political consequences if there's.
Right. Now I know you're not actually saying that they're turning the frogs gay, but I understand what you mean.
Well, it's the plastic in the water bottles or something that. I mean, it may be that like the chemicals that we are ingesting are causing us to produce more estrogen rather than lose testosterone. I don't know. I don't really follow the science of that too closely, but
Yeah, no, I've
it's
definitely heard. I
so.
haven't looked into it too much, really, but yeah, I've heard that there's estrogen in a lot of foods, and then there's the BHA, and I think like soy is one of the things, and probably chicken breast. I've even heard that beer can lower testosterone.
Mm.
So that's definitely an area that I wish people would, talk about and study more. It's tough with diet because you're constantly being told different things. There's always a new fad, whether it's paleo or vegan or whatever. Everybody wants to tell you how to eat. And I think there's probably a lot of truth into how we've grown our food over the past, say, 100 years, how that's changed. And I could definitely see there's definitely at least a correlation. It'd be I wonder how much that is causal.
Well, sugar consumption has skyrocketed over the past few decades. And I'm pretty convinced that excess sugar consumption is a very serious health malady that's causing diabetes and heart disease and obesity and all kinds of problems that would otherwise be preventable by just cutting out the sugar in your diet. And I mean, the government used to tell people they had to cut out the fats. Well, that was bogus advice. It's not the fats really that are making you fat. It's all the sugar and the junk food and the empty calories.
Right, yeah. I mean, sugar was supposed to be just something in fruit that you got when you know, did something good, and so your body gives out all these endorphins, and then you're more. It encourages you to go find more fruit, but it's supposed to be a rare occurrence. You know, now we have the middle aisles of the shopping at the grocery store just filled with all these processed junk and
Yeah,
bad,
it's just
bad for people.
filler stuff, and it's everything now. Like on the rare occasions when I go out to eat, everything is salty. It's like so much salt that you can't even taste the underlying food. And like when I make food at home for myself, I don't put salt on anything. I don't put sugar on anything. I like dessert, but that's I don't I don't drink sugary beverages with my meal and then pig out on desserts.
Hmm.
Dessert should
Hmm.
just be a reward. It's all about self-discipline. And I think most people just don't have that ability to defer gratification if they're marketed sugary products heavily, or they're marketed cigarettes or lottery tickets or whatever. You notice this, and it's afflicting low income communities. Um, they get addicted to drugs or to food or to pornography, or to debt, and they just self-destruct. It's like, so that kind of leads me to really wonder whether a total laissez-faire free market system would just be a way of exploiting people who lack that long-term mindset and that ability to be disciplined about their decisions. But
Hmm. Hmm. Well,
in a Darwinian way, ultimately I do believe in in incentivizing people to be great and not enabling people who are not great to do the reverse and exploit those who have produced.
right. And I think, I would call myself an anarchist. I would like to be in a world without government, and I think in that world you could have systems which emerge that are all voluntary, that encourage people to be honest. People say, well, there's still going to be crooks and stuff. Well, yeah, that's the point of the market, is that it should encourage people to be honest, but the market can't compete with a monopoly. And when we have this government monopoly, that throws everything out of balance. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm not arguing that therefore we should just keep doing what we're doing. I'm willing to consider maybe, government policies to throw things back into balance. Um, it is. I don't want to trust government is the thing, because somebody can always come along who can um, use that.
Well, I just never want to empower government to enact any kind of notion of fairness, because um, that's like a totalitarian position, right? Any person who gets fired for some reason he thinks is unfair, go to the government. You hear a microaggression at college, oh, unfair, get an authority, stop this. It's just ridiculous. Um, but I do think that government, even in a theoretical island nation state composed only of people with IQs above 150, there would still have to be some kind of institution that would have the characteristics of a government, where the private government would have some kind of monopoly on force, because it's just a contradiction to have like a government that makes one law and another government that makes another law, and have them both simultaneously existing in the same geographical area.
Have you read any Hoppe?
Yeah, I did come upon his writings, but I would say he wasn't in, because I didn't come upon Hoppe until after I'd read all the other major libertarian figures.
Yeah.
But he had a video presentation that I enjoyed. I think it was called Realistic Libertarianism, which sounds a lot like what I am, a libertarian realist.
Hey, Hoppe is probably, one of the best links between alt-right and libertarianism that you can find.
Yeah, because of course he coined the term physical removal.
Yes, it's a great term. Well, thank you for joining us. We're at an hour now, so that went by quick.
Yes.
And
well, it was my pleasure joining you.
Just so people know how to get a hold of you, do you want to give out your addresses and credentials and stuff?
On YouTube, Libertarian Realist, or the channel name is Libertarian Realist 2. I have a blog at libertarianrealist.blogspot.com. I am on Twitter also at GetRealist.
Excellent. Awesome.